Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of an VNture podcast. I am your host, Taros113, alongside my co-host, MR, and a very special guest we have today, PabloC. PabloC is a translator on the If My Heart Had Wings restoration patches and retranslations. And also, for a smaller title, he's solo translating himself called Wailing Genial. And so we're very happy to have him as a continuation from last week. And in this episode, we're going to dive a bit more into the whole translation philosophies and equality and what experiences PabloC has had when translating his own works. So to start us off, what are some of the different approaches you think there are involved in the translation process?
Hello everyone, and thanks for having me. I personally started my adventure with translating with a very bad example of translation, which was the official translation of Konosora, or If My Heart Had Wings. And I had a chance to spot some things that can go wrong with translation. And from that I formed my own opinions about what is the best approach to translating things in general, but especially translating Japanese things to English. And in my opinion, there are three valid approaches to translation. The first one is the proper translation. That's how I would call it. That's writing everything in the target language. So everything in the end translation is written in English. That means all Japanese expressions are either omitted or translated. For example, honorifics, words like oni-chan or one-chan, are all replaced with the English equivalents or skipped, or in some cases where the skipping is impossible, the translator needs to be creative and adapt the text so that it works in English. But in the end product, everything is written in English. The second approach is the approach that I like the most, which is, I would say, an faithful translation, or a weeb translation if we want to be mean. And that's the translation that decides not to skip some common Japanese expressions like honorifics, sensei, and so on, and instead opt for a more faithful translation, whereas everything that can be translated is still properly translated to English. And both of those approaches aim to present the reader with the experience that will be as close to the original as possible. And then there is a third approach that also can be valid in some cases, which is a localization. Localization doesn't aim to be faithful to the original. It intentionally changes some things so that audience that is not familiar with the culture or the habits of the original of the people that were authors of the original work can still get an experience that will be as close as that of a Japanese person reading the visual novel. And that approach also can have some benefits, although I'm not a big fan of it. So these are my three, I would say, valid approaches to the translation. Of course, things can go wrong in each of them, and we will try to explore as we go some examples of mistakes and over translations that can sometimes plague official releases and fan translations alike.
Yeah, and for those viewers who actually also, in addition to listening, watch our podcast, we specifically made a gallery to watch interesting examples of different quality in translation. And before we go any further, I have a topic from the previous episode that I didn't have time to ask you about. It's about the original consensus around Konosora's common route, which you cited to be, by popular demand, is why it was okay, serviceable. And before I hear your thoughts, I want to cite, because there was a wise person who wrote in 2015 about target audience for VNs, that there are three distinctive groups, each with varying standard of what it is acceptable translation quality. Group 1, People who care about prose and want to experience VNs in a way that's as close to the original writing as possible. Group number 1. Group number 2. People who don't mind the fact that translation will never be perfect. It's group number 2. And there's also a group number 3. People who simply don't give a damn about the weird thing called writing. How does that separation to groups correlates to approaches you outlined before?
Yes, that's a very good example because audience is varied between people. And from my personal example that I mentioned earlier, I heard when I was starting this entire project that, again, the common road is okay, it's perfectly readable. There is only problem with basically, essentially with one route. But when I got into things really deeply and I checked the Japanese text, it turns out that the translation, it was written in English, it was readable, it was okay, but it wasn't accurate. So there were several differences between the English text and what the Japanese line originally said. So that's something that people who only read the end product in English will probably not notice if they are not careful, because there were some things that affected the story and made some events not make sense or seemed weird because there were some mistranslations. But again, if you're not reading very carefully, if you are just enjoying the story, skimming over the text, getting to the ending very quickly without carefully thinking about the events, you will probably miss those little details and you probably won't worry about this too much. However, if you are a careful reader, you will probably find some things that don't really add up. But again, if you don't see the original, you will never know what went wrong. So,
yeah, very much agree. I feel like there's two different sides to translation. There is the meaning of the words going from, in this case, Japanese to English, and then there's also the writing of the English line, of how,
True.
That comes down to more literary strength of the writer. And
that's something that's actually a rather difficult thing, because what do you do when you are translating something that was written poorly? Do you fix the original writing? Do you write it well, or do you keep the original poor writing? Yeah, that's something that I really don't know what to do about, actually. But I didn't have the chance to encounter anything like this. But that's something that just is always in the back of my mind. Do I fix that, or do I stick to the original? I prefer sticking to the original, even if I think that something is written wrong, or if I have a chance, I try to consult the original author, as I had an opportunity with when I was working on Wading Guignol, because then I contacted the developer. I asked about some things that I thought were bugs in the original game. Turns out that in fact they were mistakes, and they were in the end fixed by the localization company that I worked with later. So, but
nice.
again, I knew that it's a mistake because it was a name tag of the character, and clearly the different character was speaking. So that was obviously a mistake. But that gave me the thought: what the translator should do with a situation like this. And I don't think the translator should fix things by themselves. It's not their job, really. But if they can, I was in a very good situation because I could consult with the localization company and the developer, and I could figure out that this is a really mistake. But that one was obvious. But again, with writing quality, that's something that's really pretty much impossible to address.
So you basically hold in very high regard preserving the original intent of author.
Yes,
as much as possible.
Yes, I am leaning very hard into the territory of translations that are as faithful as possible, at the expense of even understandability, because, like I said, I like to keep some Japanese expressions like honorifics in my translations, which is actually objectively wrong, because translation shouldn't really keep anything from the original language, should translate everything to the target language. That's the proper way, the textbook way of translating. But I intentionally do things a little differently because I think for the target audience, which is the visual novel readers, or in case of Wading Guignol, Dojin Eroge players, I think that's the approach that is most appropriate for this audience. But in order to accommodate a more general audience that is not familiar with the Japanese media, I like to include translation notes that explain various things that were left untranslated or possibly were lost in translation, because again, sometimes it's impossible to faithfully represent the original work. So in case of Konosora, I went a bit too far because I made a huge file with all sorts of translation notes explaining from the basic stuff like honorifics up to types of food with screenshots of food that is mentioned in the story.
Wow.
And everything that I found could be lost in translation. So I went too far. But I did this basically for fun and for my own practice. I don't think anyone read the whole thing because it's a huge file with translation notes, but I just had fun doing this. That's going too far, I would say. Normally, translation notes should be at 1 page, maybe 2 pages tops. They should be really short, and ideally, they should be not really necessary to understand the whole context, which is impossible in case of honorifics, because if you are not familiar with honorifics, you need to look them up. So, if you need to include translation notes, it should be really something minimal. If you are generating a huge file, you are probably doing something wrong. So I think it's ideally translation notes should be optional. So you read the entire visual novel and then you check if you are interested in, if you are really caring about the faithfulness of the translation, you check the translation notes for things that could possibly be lost.
And as a translator yourself, you try to keep it brief and simple as much as obviously as you can possibly do.
Yes, I learned from Konosora that making a huge file with translation notes, it was fun, but it was not practical. So in future translations, I try to translate as many things as possible. That's the goal of translation. But if there are things that could be lost in translation, I try to preserve the meaning. It's always a balance. So no translation will be perfect. That's why I don't really like translations, to be honest. I always try to read or experience the original, if possible. So, because I know that when I started translating myself, I know how many things really in the translation will have to adapt, omit, or change in order to be even readable without a huge file with translation notes. So, the more I started getting into translations, the less I liked translation.
Okay. So, despite being translator yourself, you still prefer reading the original way more.
Yes, okay. And
makes sense.
Yes,
the more you can see
that's even more the case now. Yes, because when I'm reading the original, well, I don't see the translation because I'm only reading the original. But when I start doing this myself, I try to do this as best as I can, and I still see that despite my efforts, some things will be simply missing. So no translation is perfect, but of course, there are translations that are better, more faithful, and some that are, well, not so great. And that leaves us with the discussion of the overall quality and what can go wrong in different approaches to translating.
On that note, you've mentioned once or twice before now that you consider the ideal translation to be one entirely in the target language, right?
Not necessarily ideal, that's the textbook translation. Yes, so, and that's what most official companies that are translating games or visual novels try to do. So, because that's how translators are probably trained, and that's the point of translation. So, getting rid of everything that is from the original language and just sticking to the target language entirely, so that everyone, no matter what is the knowledge of the medium, of the culture, everyone that speaks the target language can understand everything in the work. Of course,
there's two things I want to point out with that, though, because number one, just because it's in one language doesn't mean everyone catches the meaning of everything. I mean, if you break it down to a general example of regional dialects, in America, everyone speaks English, But if you have characters making Southern references, then it might fly over the head of, some people living in the Northeast or the West Coast. Like, for example, some people will pronounce soda differently, or pop, or cola. And honestly, I don't mean to say this is a big deal that makes distinguishing them impossible. I mean it more so that even just because the entire visual novel is in one language still doesn't make it universally understandable to everyone who speaks that language.
Yeah, that leaves the distinction between American English and British English, for example.
Mm-hmm.
That's also the case, and English that non-native speakers learn, because that's usually some mixture of British and American English. Because in schools, formally, for example, I was trained with British English, but on the internet I picked up American English, and I ended up with a weird mixture of both languages, basically.
I have the same experience, completely the same.
Yeah. Exactly.
Oh, the other thing I wanted to point out about that idea of keeping it entirely in the target language, there are some foreign words that are an entrenched part of the target language. Like, for example, in English, if you're talking about a burrito, I mean, that is very much a Hispanic word. Are you going to try to change burrito into some other English combination of words to describe it? I mean, that's not like a direct question to you, but it's like, if you have something that is that clear that you can reasonably assume most English speakers are aware of, then it sounds like that would just create more confusion for anyone reading a work. How someone's talking about how they're eating a dish of tortilla wrapped around beans and cheese and meat, and when you could just describe it all in one word, burrito,
Yeah, that's the balance with this approach to translation that also the translator needs to preserve, because there are words, if the word is commonly used, it's fine to use it, but again, it can be commonly used in the part of the US that the translator lives in, but it can be completely unknown in a different part. So that's an interesting problem. And I don't think that's a perfect approach to translation, because it's bound to create some issues, especially when it's translated by Americans for Americans, and then a European tries to read it. Because again, some things that are commonly used in America can be not so common in Europe, and it can introduce words that are completely unknown to European English speakers. So it's not a perfect approach. That's why I definitely, when I'm translating myself, I don't try to stick to the purity of English. I'm not too worried about introducing Japanese foods or some basic Japanese terms into the translation, and I assume that the person who is interested will just look them up, because, well, at least they will be getting a faithful representation of the original, and not something that is altered, which cannot work for the target audience anyway, because especially when I'm not a native speaker myself, I really don't know what works in American English, for example. And I can accidentally, like I did in Konosora, for example, introduce medical English, where it doesn't really belong, accidentally. So that's something I don't like to do. So I don't like to stick to the proper translation. I think the faithful translation that has some foreign words is a perfectly fine approach, and actually it works best for this particular medium that is a rather niche medium, and it's aimed at a very specific demographic. So I think that all of the entirety of the target audience of visual novels will be familiar to some extent with basic Japanese expressions, and most of the people that are vocal about translation quality seem to enjoy seeing honorifics and such expressions left in the text. So that's what I'm going for. But the ideal approach would be two translations. One translation that is entirely in English, and the second one that contains honorifics. Of course, that's an extra work, and official companies don't tend to have such approach. But this would be the perfect way, or rather as good of a translation as you can possibly get. So something for everyone.
Okay, so and given your experience as a fan translator, I guess this is exceedingly difficult to introduce in a game that natively does not support multiple options in such a way.
Yes, especially for unofficial translations. It's sometimes it's basically impossible. The official ones, it's also not that easy. For example, I tried to do this with Wailing Guignol. Since it was a very simple game, omitting honorifics and such was rather simple. So I did 2 versions, and I asked the developer if they were the localization company if they would be interested in releasing both versions, because they had Japanese version and English version on Steam already, so they could add another one. But they told me that this would be a lot of work actually, because they would have to put everything together, playtest everything from scratch. So basically, it's the same work as doing with the original translation. So that wasn't really viable, actually. So that's it's more difficult than it seems, because from the translation point of view, that's in this case it was very simple, because there was one situation where that required some creative translation, when someone said to stop referring to them with a certain honorific, but it was just one scene. In Konosora, it's happened multiple times in every route, so good luck with omitting honorifics there.
Oh my god. So in order to remove honorifics, you would also need to alter the context in some way. Or even cut the entire scene altogether.
Yes, it's a very common thing in Japan. When people get together, get close, they stop referring to each other using honorifics. So in the case of Konosora, it was to stop calling me Kotori-chan, just say Kotori. Which is a very big thing, actually, because it signifies that people are getting closer, and it's an important thing from the point of view of developing relationships. And how do you do this in English?
Yeah. Well, there are ways, to be fair.
There are ways. Yeah, they are difficult. So in case of Konosora, they did something very weird, like I don't even remember. It was something so unnatural. It was basically I will let you push my wheelchair, something like that.
Oh, they just made up a completely new experience.
Just made up something, and it didn't make sense.
Yeah, made up another excuse to showcase trust, I guess.
Yeah.
That's the best I can deduce given the quote, right?
Yeah, it was something like that. It was, but it was difficult to do. I didn't know how to localize it myself, so I just left the honorifics intact. It's an easier solution, and it's more faithful to the original, so I prefer this. But doing a proper translation and properly adapting such things can be very difficult. And again, official localizers sometimes don't have the time and resources to actually bother with it. Especially when the official localization delegates the translation to some different company. Because sometimes the localization company doesn't have an in-house translation. They just send the files to some external company, and they just mail the translated files back, without necessarily reading the whole story, without necessarily playing the game. So this can introduce a lot of errors. Because if you don't know the context, you basically do the same thing as machine translators. Because machine translators don't get the context, and they produce hilarious mistakes. But a human translator who doesn't know the context can accidentally do the same thing.
Businesses have very different priorities than a typical fan translator, or even an official translator for that matter. I remember you said for wanting to make 2 copies for Wailing Guignol, how you contacted the company and they decided, they didn't want to put all that manpower and all the hours into it. So, even though you have hopes for higher quality translations and for doing something that would be best product for everyone, I mean, the business also has to measure, well, this is time we could be spending on something else. Is it going to get us more money than not? And they have to make that, executive call,
Yes, exactly. And my translation speed, for example, is completely non-viable for any sort of official work because I'm way too slow. So something like whaling guineol should take 1-2 months at best, and not almost 2 years. So again, from a business perspective, it's a completely ridiculous translation speed. But then again, it's not my full-time job, so I can do this only in my free time when I feel like it. So that's why it's taking so long. But again, for the official release, it's not really viable. And which means that you don't really have the time to do full research. For Konosora, for example, I had to research aerodynamics, aviation, and so on.
True.
The official company doesn't pay for this. So you are paid for the lines that you are sending in. So, well, who wants to do this when it's your job and it's your food on the table depends on it? It's not really viable. That's where fan translators can have an advantage over official translators, because they can take their time and they are not doing this for money. They can take as long as they basically want, which is very long in my case, for example.
Yeah, because it's a passion project. They are more invested also. So
yes,
there is.
On the other hand,
well, that's not always. They're not always invested solely by passion.
Yeah,
there are some who try to get started on a fan translation in the hopes of selling it to a company, and this can sometimes work out for them, and sometimes it doesn't. But that's its own issue.
Yeah, there's also an issue with people who do this for popularity. So they can do basically a lightly edited machine translation, release it, and then, well, they get popularity, whatever, clicks, I don't know, maybe something on Patreon, donations, and so on. So yeah, there are also a lot of issues with fan translation, obviously.
So you right now outline another problem, because I cited that there are 3 groups of people, and there's specific group 3 that just doesn't give a damn about the quality. And it is a niche within a niche for those translators who use shortcuts to fill, because they can quickly deliver using machine translation and churn out translation for those who just have no patience or sense of quality.
Yes, exactly. And that's potentially a problem, because when this machine translation crowd basically grows into a significant size, this can basically destroy the concept of translations, because there will be a official company that picks up this as a business model, and then officially releases basically a lightly edited machine translations, or not edited at all. And this actually happens with one of the Steam publishers that releases Doujin Eroge. So they basically release a crappy quality, basically machine translations. Horribly censored, of course, for Steam purposes, but I think they have patches somewhere on their website, and they just throw them out one title after another. And if enough people buy it, the costs are none, because it's basically a guy with the machine translator and runs everything through Google, so that's almost free. So yeah, that's a very cheap production cost with very good, very high quantity of titles, and if some people buy this, it's probably profitable.
Yes, so, as long as there is buyers, there will be market for a thing. That's sad to hear.
Yeah, even if it has typos too.
Yeah, typos is something that can happen, but shouldn't really in official releases that should have proper quality check. In fan translations, well, that's a different story, because there are different teams. Ideally, there should be a quality checker in the team that should go over everything, not to mention an actual editor, because fan translation projects rarely have proper editors. They have a translator that writes everything as it should be, basically as an end product, and then they have quality checkers that sometimes are credited as editors, but I rarely see a properly edited text. We had some attempts at that, but in Konosora, but we didn't have proper editing. Fortunately, I'm not a bad writer, so what I wrote and edited myself was probably acceptable. but it's far from ideal. It should be ideally properly edited by a skilled writer, basically, and written properly in proper English, and so on. So there's a lot to be desired.
I mean, you described a lot of problems with adapting the context, writing, sentence structure, quality of the writing itself. But there's also another aspect I wanted to bring up. And through those screenshots that we provided that run in the background, we showcase the example of Muramasa, which had to change their interface stylistically to suit the translation. In the original edition, they had a very thin vertical lines for which they could build sentences in Japanese, but that style of UI couldn't really work with the UI for proper English translation. And what's your experience when it comes to adapting even user interface for such a thing? Because if I remember correctly, Wailing Ginjo had a gameplay element. So I guess some of those parts have to accommodate different sizes. Buttons maybe had to be changed.
Yes, that's a huge issue actually when translating from Japanese to English, because of a simple fact that Japanese sentences and words and terms tend to be very short. While when you try to write it in English, it turns out that the three Chinese characters turn out to be a three-word sentence that is much longer and takes much larger space. And then when you have a game with actual gameplay elements, buttons, interface, and so on, well, you have to be very mindful of the space that you have at your disposal, because it's very common to write something that is too long to fit into the text box or on the button or something like that. So I had this issue. I had to think really hard how to translate some skills or parts of the interface so that they fit in the boxes that they are supposed to go. So sometimes,
okay,
that's a huge issue.
The very first Final Fantasy game on I think it was the NES, along with a few other games, they had the same problem where the ability names and skills were like 4 kanji maximum. And in Japanese, you can say a lot with just 4 kanji. Usually you only need 2 or maybe 3. Except when you try translating it into English, now you only have 4 letters maximum to describe all the different skills and abilities in the game. That it led to many abbreviations and a lot of unclear naming conventions. Like, I remember lightning had to get changed to LIT1, and then the stronger lightning is LIT2, LIT3. And that's not immediately obvious what that means. Anyone would think lit, and it's like, huh?
Yeah, so, that's a horror.
Those are some of the things. It's like on top of all the translation problems with different theories and not making any errors and stuff. Sometimes you just have to work in ridiculous situations because of how the programming is set up.
Yes, at least RPG Maker automatically reduced the font size, so everything mostly fit, but sometimes it turned out to be very condensed and hard to read. So again, I had to find out synonyms for some skills, because the faithful translation simply was not viable. It didn't fit on the screen. So that's a huge issue. And also a text box is limited in size in visual novels, and sometimes the engine doesn't allow you to add different lines that go to the next text box. So you have to fit all the Japanese, all the content from the Japanese line into one text box. And that can be an issue because, again, Japanese can be very condensed. So when you have a long sentence full of kanji in Japanese, and you try to write everything that was inside in English, you can turn with 3 or 4 lines of text. That was an issue in Konosora, but fortunately, I was able to shorten everything correctly without sacrificing any accuracy. And then our hacker figured out how to add extra lines, so that was a non-issue entirely. But some engines can cause problems, especially in fan translation, because with official translations, usually you have a better access to programmers, you have official support from the developer, so those issues probably are easier to fix.
I'd say sometimes, not always.
It's not guaranteed, but sometimes it happens, like with the example of Muramasa, where they changed the UI to accommodate. Yeah. And I have to give props, because all the Runs games that got translated had a very nicely fitted UI. So they probably used some of your techniques of trying to convey with a least amount of words meaning in the Japanese. And for example, as another example, Venus Blood made a lot of tooltips. Not sure if the original game had tooltips, but on the English translation there were a lot of tooltips. So they had a way, when you hover over something that was abbreviated, to look at the full length name.
And that's a perfect approach, because it lets you write the complete full translation and then abbreviation that fits into the right box. So that's really the best approach. That's why I'm backing their Kickstarters, because they're really doing a great job at adapting those things. And titles with gameplay that have complicated interface tend to be quite difficult, because visual novels usually you have to only worry about the length of the text in the text box and not much else. There is usually very little complicated interface, although there can be text embedded on pictures that requires a completely different approach, because you have to open Photoshop and edit the pictures themselves.
It is not easy at all.
Yeah, that's not easy, and usually requires another person on the team, because the translator doesn't necessarily have the skills to do this by themselves. I could do this with Wailing Guignol, because I don't think there was anything on the images, so I didn't really need to edit anything.
Oh, okay.
But with more complicated titles that have some text on the screens, well, that needs to be translated as well. So, well, that's a different story, because you need someone with the image editing skills on the team. So not just the translator, but someone skilled with Photoshop or GIMP or something like that, which adds another layer of complication to the whole thing.
And for a business, that's another skill set you need someone to have. That's a larger team. It's more work, more money.
Yes, though usually you would expect to have someone on the team, because you need to make a layout for the store page, make banners and promotion materials. So usually they have someone to design a website for the store. So they usually have some graphic designers, I would imagine. Unless it's a very small localization company, they can have a very limited team, and that can be a problem in this case. So it all depends on on how big the company really is, because small companies, sometimes they have only translators, editors, or not even translators, and they can outsource their translations somewhere else. So there can be issues with that.
In the examples that are run in the background, we specifically put one that remade the entire text from Yotsunoha in a diary, and the other was Muv-Luv approach, meaning they not only redid CGs translated, but also gave you the choice of either seeing the originals or the remade ones independently of your preferred language of translation. That was actually very good. That combined both having multiple options and remaking CGs.
Yes, that's really the perfect approach. And of course, it's wishful thinking, but really
the most expensive.
That's really how the best possible translation should look like. So, two options with the proper translation and faithful translation with honorifics and such. And if there are CGs, original ones or translated ones, for you to choose from. That's really probably as good as the translation can get.
Yes, and on that note, I think we reached the end of this episode. Thank you once more, PabloC, for your insight into the translation landscape and all the discussions we had on the multitude of examples we had discussed and didn't discuss that were running in the background.
Well, the pleasure is all mine.
Very glad to have you.
I'm glad to be here as well, and thank you for inviting me.
Yes, and thank you everyone for listening and tuning into this week's episode. Please make sure if you enjoyed it, let us know what, if anything, you'd like us to do better, other topics to cover, or just if you're liking how everything's going so far. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.